In this video, I'm going to talk about a research-based update to the first year experience. And this is a recording after a presentation I gave to a group of faculty. I unfortunately forgot to hit the record button when we were doing the Teams meeting, but hopefully this recaps some of what I was discussing during that meeting so that others who were not able to attend will be able to see what it is that the conversation was revolving around. Over the summer, Dean Kuhn and I decided to look at some of the best practices for first year experiences, and I wanted to share in this presentation some of my findings. First, I want to discuss the rationale. Why do we even start to look at the first year experience, and what is it that we're hoping to accomplish? One of the things that I found out last year when I was writing the program development report for the Interdisciplinary Studies program was that in 2018, the program was asked to have a significant data-driven reevaluation and overhaul of the core curriculum. So they were asking for it to be more effective, more relevant, and more explicit. And this is 2018. So I have just started my role as the chair last year during that time when I was writing that, and I found this document and read through it. And so that seemed pretty stark evidence that we needed to at least think about our learning outcomes and some of the things that we are doing in our IDS program, and specifically the core curriculum. In the 2023-2026 strategic plan for Lakeland, it includes some information about the development and implementation of data-informed strategies to increase term-to-term retention and graduation rates. So what are we doing? How do we bring that into our curriculum? It seems to make sense to look at the Interdisciplinary Studies program where we manage and all students are taking those classes, and that is certainly something that we could do in the core curriculum if we're looking at that. Our IDS program assessment has been out of date for a number of years. We tried to address some of those things last year, but the learning outcomes are still not clear how they map to institutional outcomes or how they map to specific classes. So I would really like to look at those learning outcomes and to make sure that we're actually, I think we're maybe doing more in those classes than what those learning outcomes are saying that we are. And I think we can be more explicit and relevant in this day and age as the above PDC report requested. Finally, I want to just kind of mention that I've been doing some research on critical thinking, and I think that there's not really much of a concern or debate that critical thinking is important. I think that everyone agrees that, and everyone agrees that you can develop that. I think where there is a little bit of controversy and there's not quite everyone believing in this generalizable critical thinking skills, that we can generally develop critical thinking skills and they can always transfer to other areas. It's typically, I think there are different groups that believe these different things, but I think that we do develop critical thinking skills, certainly in our domains, in our majors, and I think we can develop critical thinking skills in core, but I think we need to be careful about what we're expecting to see from that. And I think that we have to recognize that the generalizable critical thinking that we think is transferable, it's very debated in the field, and it's not, it's a little bit contentious. So I think that we should walk that back a little bit because right now our program is kind of modeled on this idea that you can develop generalizable critical thinking skills and those can be transferred to any field. So I think that perhaps we should think about that and consider that when we're looking at our curriculum. And the Tourneau et al. Was just one example of a paper that it was a good review of some of the belief systems of critical thinking, and then there was some experimentation and looking at how they use critical thinking in science and math and how it did or did not transfer over in different disciplines. One of the primary sources I used for this work that I'll present to you today is this Thriving in Transitions book that is a second edition written by Laurie A. Schreiner and colleagues, and she has kind of gone through, it's almost a big literature review. So there is a lot of data, a lot of information that is looking at a research-based approach to college student success. And I think that there's a lot of information here to suggest and provide some information about how we could develop our program learning outcomes, and in order to address some of those requests from our strategic plan, where we want to do a data-informed strategy to increase term-to-term retention. So this book really focuses on exactly that, not only for first-year students, so the transitions that it's referring to are kind of this transition from high school to college, and then transitioning from that freshman year to sophomore year, and different types of groups transitioning. So there's a lot of really good information. It's really high level, but it does go into some of the details. If you really want to look at the charts and the data, it has that in it as well. But I was kind of looking for some basic ideas to start structuring our program to help with some of this idea of developing those term-to-term retention with our students, and allowing students to start to thrive and succeed. So we'll talk about that in a moment. This is also building off of work that I was doing or looking at from something that Elizabeth Strout, the former IDS chair from the previous year, she had given me this book, Fostering Habits of Mind in Today's Students. This book is really good. It's a little more in the weeds, and it talks about very specific things. There is a little bit of research that's balanced throughout there as well, but it provides some really good experiences and student activities that help to develop some of these positive habits of mind that are listed here. And I think that I've used some of them in my core class, and I've enjoyed using those. And I think that that idea is really interesting, because these positive habits of mind are meant to help students and are shown to be able to be developed and built and grown so that they can be better students and succeed. So this was really interesting. This book was one that I think worked really well with that Thrivings and Transitions, because the Thriving book was a little bigger, like kind of a broader view. And then this gets down into specific things. And there are a lot of overlap with these ideas to help build students and make them be able to succeed and persist. So the Thriving book by Schreiner et al. Looked at this, what is success really in college? What does that mean? So they defined that for us in there. They talked about academic attainment, looking at the general education, right? So the liberal arts, we're trying to generally educate these students in a broad range of academic disciplines, looking at developing academic competence in those, right? And you're really thinking about critical thinking skills in those disciplines, right? So they have enough information to kind of start to solve some of those problems you might have in that domain. And then develop of cognitive skills. And I think the big important one, especially in this discussion that we're going to have today, is the intellectual dispositions. So the intellectual dispositions, that's something that we can develop, that we can give them a way to start to think about how they are viewing what they're doing and how they perceive their intellectual abilities and all of that. So that's really coming back to kind of the fostering habits of mind, where we have metacognition. How are you thinking? Are you flexible in the way you're thinking? Are you able to continue engagement and be persistent, and then feel like you have self-efficacy so that you feel like you can do it and you will do it? You have the positive attitude. Occupational attainment is the other part of this. It's not just what you're doing at Lakeland. What's going to happen next? Are you prepared for that adulthood and that citizenship, personal accomplishment, personal development? So these are also important things that people want to feel accomplished, that they've done things that they've developed further, right? So those are important for that occupation. Have they defined what they want to do? Do they know where they want to go? Do they feel like they're prepared for that? taking a look at the Lakeland University mission statement, we look at Lakeland University educates individuals of diverse backgrounds, preparing them to think critically, to communicate effectively, to succeed professionally, and to lead ethical, purposeful, and fulfilling lives. So we have this mission statement, and this is just part of it. It goes on, right? But this is, I think, what really connects with what we consider success in college, that work really well together. So that's good that some of the research that we're looking at supports what our current mission is. The title of that book, if you recall, is Thriving in Transition. So what is thriving? And it's really related to that success. So they found that when students are successful and they're doing those things, they're also thriving. They have certain characteristics and dispositions that are allowing them to be successful. And those include engaged learning. So making connections with what they know and what they want to know, and that they want to learn it. So they have an interest in learning. So it's that's disposition that is important. Academic determination. So they want to do well. They want to pass their classes, and not only just pass, but also willingness to invest the necessary effort to succeed and achieve their goals. Positive perspective. So looking at that psychological lens where students will have an optimistic worldview of their future, of their ability to succeed, that self-efficacy. Diverse citizenship is really important, and I think it's the value of looking at and valuing different people's differences, right? That diversity is valuable, and recognizing that they are different and that difference is valuable. So that everyone doesn't have to be the same, everyone doesn't have to look the same. That difference is actually really valuable, but at the same time, still being connected socially. So you're still able to make healthy relationships. You're valuing other people's experiences and what they are and what they do. But you're also recognize that you're making those connections, and you're able to connect, and you appreciate that difference, and you want to understand that difference. So all of these things suggest and support this thriving idea, and thriving then supports success. These things can all be, according to Schreiner et al., taught and developed during this process, during the educational process. So that's what a lot of that research was based on, looking at what they called the thriving quotient, and developing these in order to help improve success. The four pillars model had been brought up a few times previous in different contexts, but this also, there seems to be a connection here between this thriving idea and the pillars of learning that we're looking at Lakeland. And I think they can also, with this, they can be cultivated through these positive habits of mind. Again, these are those thriving quotient ideas, but that self-efficacy, right? Having that positive perspective that they can succeed, that belonging, that social connectedness, and that understanding of that diverse citizenship. I think that is part of that as well. What is that purpose, right? The determination and the engaged learning, and then the growth mindset as well, right? That's part of the positive perspective and determination, and understanding that we're all different and we can all grow and continue to learn. So these things with the positive habits and the thriving, I think they work really well with what we're already aiming to do. Just for me, I think it helps to have some, these are all, I think this was developed in an evidence-based fashion, but now I've also been able to connect that myself. And hopefully that this helps to connect those things as well with all of you. I mentioned the thriving quotients a few slides ago, and here are the 5 different components of that, and that can be studied and have been studied and looked at to be involved in student success. And some students come in with these already. Some students have developed these in high school or before, but some need to develop them. And I think the important thing to point out is that this research-based approach suggests that students can develop these. So for me, that gave me some hope that maybe this is something that we can focus on and look at to help us develop our IDS curriculum, to look at some of the learning outcomes and some of the positive habits of mind that we can use for kind of the foundation of our program and build off of that. And I think that also it's encouraging that they've done research on that. So there's some way to assess this, and that's getting a little more into the weeds, but would be the next step, would be we have to develop learning outcomes and then look at how we can assess those. So where does critical thinking fit into all of this? And I think that it is certainly a component, and it is going to be a component for our majors. It can still be a component of our distributional studies. But I think we have to kind of de-emphasize the overall generalizable critical thinking skills and maybe focus on some of the critical thinking skills that support those positive habits of mind and those thriving characteristics. So for example, if we're thinking about metacognition, like thinking about how you think, there are certain things that can certainly help students feel, develop that self-efficacy. That's kind of a psychological critical thinking skill that may be more generalizable. So I think that we maybe want to focus on some of the more, the ones that can help support some of these ideas in the thriving quotient, rather than just generalizable critical thinking that maybe don't. There are all sorts of different connections that we need to look at, and the well-being and flexibility. So this diagram came from the European Framework for Personal, Social, and Learning to Learn Key Competence. So this is something that where they have also put together, and it's very similar to some of the thriving quotients and the positive habits of mind. But critical thinking is certainly a component of that overall well-being. And I think that those are all it's just one aspect of it. And I think perhaps right now, the title suggests that this is all about critical thinking, but I think that maybe we want to look at the title of core and think about what it is we're actually doing there, and to try to be, again, like the program development report suggested, maybe we can be more explicit about what we're doing and make sure that our learning outcomes match what we are actually doing in the classroom. So using those resources, I put together a group of learning outcomes that I thought would be appropriate for the program, for for the Interdisciplinary Studies program. Our current learning outcomes include writing, coherence, correct prose, using writing as a tool for thinking and analysis, general writing skills, so a lot of writing ideas, which is fine, but almost a third of what we have here. Perform basic mathematical statistical functions, and then we kind of get into these critical thinking ideas, evaluating different types of information, examining problems from multiple disciplinary perspectives, make decisions in an evidence-based fashion, and demonstrate knowledge of multiple academic disciplines. So there are a number of these. So how can we make these more explicit and relevant to maybe what we want to do to help support success in our students? So here I have suggested that we still include effective communication, maybe a little less just specifically talking about writing skills, but overall communication. And I think that in our different courses, we can certainly drill in on writing and or other verbal communication or whatever you want to do. But I think this is a more general learning outcome for our program that I think can be broken down a little more in other courses and other areas. Information literacy, I think, is important, right? We want to have students be able to, and these are kind of some of those general, when we look at success, the general education information that we really want them to have. So success was, if we go back to that slide, academic attainment, acquisition of general education, and development of academic competencies. So I think these are really important, and I think we all agree. Information literacy, being able to find, evaluate, ethically use that information, I think those are going to be important to maintain. Collaboration is something that is not in here currently, but it was found to be something that builds that social connectedness that I think is going to be valuable. So working collaboratively with others to respect diverse perspectives and contribute effectively to achieving common goals. So that builds on what we had to incorporate some of those thriving ideas. Ethical and social responsibility. So again, this diverse citizenship idea, we're trying to have people understand that there are differences between people and that those differences are important. Persistence and resilience. So looking at how do we develop the ability for students to adapt to new situations, embrace change, bounce back from setbacks, demonstrate resilience and a growth mindset. So that's all related to those positive habits and giving those students that academic determination and positive perspective that are important for thriving. Metacognition, this is kind of one of those critical thinking skills that allows students to engage in their regulation of emotions, thoughts, behaviors to promote personal growth and well-being, also a component of that thriving aspect. Thinking flexibility, to look at approaching problems with an open mind. Engaged learning, so that is really important for fostering that intellectual disposition, right? That passion in learning, that curiosity. So they want to seek out that information because they want to, not because they need to for a test on Tuesday. Exploring vocation is something that also was discussed. I mean, that success in college, they talked about occupational attainment and that component exploring life goals and career aspirations relative to one's life or values, the good life. So I also, in conversation with Dr. Kuhn, also kind of came up with that one. I think that's an important component of this as well. I wanted to map those proposed program learning outcomes with our institutional learning outcomes, which are part of that mission statement, where we think critically, communicate effectively, succeed professionally, and lead ethical, purposeful, fulfilling lives. And I think they map pretty well. I'm not going to walk through them all individually, and there's possible that maybe we could add checks here or there somewhere else, but I think it does map well with what we are saying we want to do still. So it's not like we're missing something by changing these learning outcomes to what I proposed. Next, I wanted to map the current program learning outcomes with the current curricular units. So those different parts of, the college skills, composition, and mathematics, and the distributional studies would be the history, the art, the math, the religion, the natural social sciences, right? So that's a different curricular unit. And then the critical thinking core 1, 2, and 3. So how do these all match up? This is how they're mapped in our current curricular map. So we see that through these 3 different units, we're able to accomplish all of these different goals. So I also then wanted to map our current curricular units with the proposed program learning outcomes. And this is where I kind of put the X's. And I just wanted to let you know, these are based on looking at the course learning outcomes. So looking at the core course learning outcomes. Now, the distributional studies, right, you might say, well, we do this in psychology, or we do this in some class that, they might take, but they're not explicitly listed, and it's not clear when and where they're actually getting maybe some of these. So there are places where we might be able to put X's, but based on our current course learning outcomes and our current description of what we're doing, we don't know that students are getting metacognition, for example, if they're not taking a social science. I don't know where else that's happening, or if they hit it in a different place. So this is the best I was able to do based on the general description of our courses. Just for reference, these are our current learning objectives for core 1, 2, and 3. And this was put together by Dr. Struett, where she took some of these things are listed in various places in different ways. So that's why there's some red and green writing. But either way, I think we need to look at those and address those either on our website, in our catalog, in our documents for assessment, and clean this up as well. But these are the learning outcomes. And again, one thing that I've asked on the survey is, should we look at core 2 and core 3? And I don't know what, I think generally people would like to just focus on one thing at a time. But I would like to point out that one of the few learning outcomes for core 2 is to reinforce those skills in core 1. So if we are changing core 1, we might want to either take that out or address different skills that maybe we're not reinforcing those always. And then core 3 also says that same thing. So depending on what we're doing, if we're doing something for a first year seminar, first year student, those things might be and maybe should be different than what we're doing in core 3 or core 2. But these are the current learning outcomes I was using to fill out that assessment map. And that's why you might say, well, I do something in this course and I think that there should be an X there. It maybe isn't there because you might be doing that in your course, but it's not described here. If you find that that's not the case, you go back and look at that and say, oh no, analyzing foundational text, that is going to have them be involved in metacognition, then we can have that conversation and update that. But I think it's important that our course learning outcomes map our program learning outcomes, and then our course learning outcomes should be able to be assessed. So how are we assessing these things? And then how do they map to the program and backwards from there? So kind of going back to those program learning outcomes and how they map to those different sets of our program, I kind of highlighted what we're missing a little bit. I think the big thing I think respect diverse perspectives was part of that, but the working collaboratively to do that and contributing to achieve a common goal, that wasn't part of our objectives in the core. So even though I did check this off, the collaboration part was not necessarily there. Persistence and resilience, metacognition, engaged learning, vocal discernment, those 4 areas I think are also not currently being addressed. So what does that research suggest a first year seminar might look like? What supports thriving and future success for students? The effective communication, information literacy, collaboration, all of these things that I basically put in those learning outcomes. So that's what's suggested, and that's why those things are put in there. So the goal would be to try to incorporate at least some of these or all of them into whatever the students are doing. And I think that the big thing is bringing students together and looking at and bringing them together and looking at what they can do as a group. So the guiding recommendations from that book, looking at intentional mechanisms on campus to connect students to social networks. Involvement needs to be selective, so they need to be able to select that experience and opportunity, intentional and meaningfully connect to those larger campus communities. So how do we build a first year experience that allows them to have some autonomy in the decisions that they're making and the kind of the groups they're being assigned to, but then also like connects them to the larger community? So also a big thing in here, the guiding recommendation was to connect students and faculty to their majors is particularly beneficial. So if we have some way to, in these groupings or in these experiences, to have those program champions in the major be involved or make connections during this first year experience, I think that would also be beneficial and valuable in multiple ways. And then service learning courses, living learning communities. This is going to be challenging unless we decide how we want to do that in terms of our class schedules. So I think we would have to, if we ever wanted to move to something where we had these living learning communities, maybe you have someone in a first year seminar and they're living close to each other and they're taking composition 1 together. They have a couple of common classes together like that. We would have to look at the schedule and figure out how to do that more systematically, because our current scheduling doesn't allow that. So if we wanted to move towards this, that would reduce faculty autonomy, but it is a recommendation of this book. Living learning communities that have themes. So we have spoken about that, and I think the themes is a great idea, but again, we need to, if we're going to allow them to be selective, the students get to select what they want to be in, we have to think about that scheduling again. We have to think about how we're going to, what are appropriate themes, what are not appropriate themes. So right now, all I want to do is figure out the program and the course learning outcomes. And then the next step, which is probably the much harder step, is what exactly are we going to implement? What are our themes going to be? Who's going to be teaching the course? How many different themes are we going to have? And how is this all going to work? So would be the next step if we wanted to continue down this path of curricular updates. So I also looked at the National Resource Center for First Year Experience and Student in Transitions, and they have some guiding recommendations for first year seminars as well. And they describe that first year seminar as a course intended to enhance the academic and or social integration of the first year student by introducing them to a variety of specific topics, which vary by seminar type, which is what we've been talking about. To essential skills for college success. So that's also what I'm proposing. We look at college skills or positive habits of mind. And then C, to selected processes, the most common of which is the creation of a peer support group. So building those communities are going to be important. Small class sizes, we've got that going for us. Discussion focused, which is already kind of what we're doing in our Core 1 courses. Emphasis on creating community. So I don't know that that's always happened. It's at least not an explicit learning outcome for that course. So that would be something where we're talking about the recommendations from 2018 be more explicit and relevant. So having some of those community-based learning outcomes would be valuable. Navigating university systems. I think that is something we can discuss as well. And we have in the past incorporated that into our Core 1 courses. Co-teaching with upper class peers, instructors, or co-advisors. So this is also something that's interesting. In the meeting with faculty on this subject, we had a long conversation about advising and professional advising that I won't repeat here, but this is also something that we could perhaps, if we're talking about, I know some people want to just look at Core 1 and not mess around with the other categories, but depending on what we'd want to do, we could develop something where it would give students opportunities, upper class students, to come in and interact in those classrooms in a different way, having been through one of those classes before, but then being able to be a peer teacher or a peer person in that group. It could be interesting, but something that's recommended, but certainly not something we have to incorporate. I think something also to think about for this first year experience, there are the patterns and stages and meeting students where they are and giving them the information when they need it, how they need it. So this was taken from Dr. Albrink's model from our remedial education plans last year, 2 years ago. And I think it might be really great to kind of work with Campus Life and the director of first year experience to kind of create some of these short teaching modules that could be incorporated into the course at specific timeframes. So when we kind of already do this with some of our advising, I think, but there might be other opportunities to bring things in when they're needed. An example of something we're going to do PR training. So the suicide prevention or suicide help training to kind of give people resources they need to help others get support when they need it. So things like that we could bring in these little modules of of training and discussion that's going to help when they need it. So something that we could also think about developing in that classroom setting for our first year seminars. So the next steps are a little more difficult. We want to kind of transition away from we're not taking out critical thinking entirely, but taking that focus off of it a little more and to include and incorporate the positive habits of mind and the critical thinking skills that help promote those positive habits of mind and the thriving. So thinking about kind of building on those a little bit. I've proposed just a first year seminar description. So a few different places and areas I've been told that core, this title is confusing and could be reworked, and something we can change it to something different than first year seminar. But I think that it might be worth getting away from that core idea, unless we're going to describe it as something else. But I don't think students understand what core is, and it takes a lot of explanation to get there. And first year seminar seems to make more sense to them when I mention it to my students anyway. So we can come up with something different than what I have here. But again, I just tried to make a general course description that wasn't very descriptive at this point, because I know that there is an interest in pursuing this idea of themes in our core curriculum. So then those themes would then be sub descriptions that would be more specific, that would still hopefully be able to reach those learning outcomes that we as a group decide later on. If we did adopt the learning outcomes that I am suggesting, then we would, I think that we would have to develop some type of assessment that could happen later. But I think that we would be able to do something to assess these different learning outcomes. The one thing that we're not really doing, that I haven't really spoken too much about, is that exploring vocation. How are we assessing that? Are we going to do that? Is it too much for Core 1? We do have other classes at Lakeland, our EXP 100. We have the experiential learning that's happening. So that could be a component of this. And if we did, we could also look at some of how these other things fit in here to assess our learning outcomes. I think Core 3 also maps really well with some of these. And then do we want to? Are we just reaffirming some of these things in Core 2? These things I think a lot of people would prefer to wait on, but I think we could, with these program learning outcomes, I think there would be ways that we could do assessments, but we might want to update the learning outcomes in these classes to be more explicit and similar. I think it's possible to do these in a similar manner that we're doing them now, but update the learning outcomes so that they match for assessment purposes, if for no other reason. But I think that there is some value to be explicit about these so that when we have other instructors that are coming in for the first time, they know that these are the things that we're focusing on, maybe more than what it says in the description currently for our learning outcomes. So I think I think we could still do a lot of what we're doing in these classes and meet these, but I think we might need to make more of an effort to maybe add a few things to make sure that we're hitting these goals. The other exploring vocation, again, we don't really do that currently either in these other classes. And there's not, I'm not sure, maybe we can, but it might be difficult to add all of that in. One other proposal, it would be to look at adding experiential learning to the Interdisciplinary Studies program. So this is the NACE competencies, looking at career readiness and what is looked at for being career ready. And these are some of those competencies. So current IDS certainly focuses on communication and critical thinking. So those would be in there. If we build out with the proposed learning outcomes, we maybe equity, inclusion, and teamwork would be included in there as well. Maybe leadership, since we're talking about groups and team building, that probably would be maybe a star 2. So this isn't perfectly organized, I would say, but if we would add experiential learning, some of the components there, we would make sure that we would meet all of those NACE competencies as well in our general education curriculum. So that was another possibility that we could add. That's another component of the survey that was sent out. To, if you agree with adding something like that, some component of that would be another conversation to build out this general studies curriculum. So these are, I believe, most of the resources and references that I included. And thank you for your time or watching this video. And if you have any questions or comments or suggestions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Jared McGivern, and I'm happy to work with you as we look at updating our general studies curriculum. Thank you.